Hello, in this demonstration, I will show how to use cloud-native development tools on Google Cloud Platform in order to deploy a PySpark application on Kubernetes. So the idea is to use Google Cloud Shell, in particular the Cloud Shell editor, to deploy a PySpark application on the Google Kubernetes engine, or GKE. So this is a third video, I believe, on using Docker in Kubernetes. The idea is to package up your PySpark application into Docker, and I've got a couple other videos demonstrating that, in particular how to deploy that application to Kubernetes, but Kubernetes on Docker for desktop. So now I'm going to deploy the same application using Docker, but I'm going to deploy it to the Google Kubernetes engine, and I'm only use cloud-based tools. So just imagine, and I've got a couple students that have really bad laptops that need to be upgraded, and so they don't have enough computing power to run PyCharm and Docker for desktop, and then run a Kubernetes cluster, even the Docker for desktop Kubernetes cluster. So if you have a crummy laptop and you want to run all of these demonstrations, you can mostly do it using the cloud native development. So this is going to focus on cloud native development with Kubernetes. So here's the video C. The agenda for this video is to focus on using the Cloud Shell editor to deploy a PySpark application to GKE. For more information about packaging up your PySpark application into Docker and deploying to a Kubernetes cluster, see my prior videos that demonstrate each of those. So we're going to focus on using this Google Cloud Shell editor. And here's the editor, what it looks like, and you can go to idecloudgoogle.com, and typically I just open up a project in Google Cloud Platform, and there's a place there to open up a shell, and then the shell open up the editor. So the shell editor is based on Eclipse Thea. So if you're familiar with Eclipse, you have some idea of the background of this, but there's a variation on it that's quite a bit different than the original Eclipse, and that's Thea. And it's intended to be a cloud-based platform. It operates like VSCode, so if you know how to run VSCode, this will be quite familiar to you. If you want some tutorials on VSCode, here's some examples. So the Cloud Shell editor, as I mentioned, is like VSCode, but there's some introduction to to the Cloud Shell editor by Google in particular, and here's a web page for it. It's also been in some conferences. Here's Cloud Next 19. They introduced it, and you can watch the video, which was pretty informative. Additionally, there's a series by this guy, I guess he's a Google employee, deploying on GKE with Cloud Shell editor, and you can watch that. He also shows how to deploy to Minikube, as well as the Google Kubernetes engine. So I'm going to follow that sort of style of things, but I'm going to do it for the application I've been working with, and I'll point out some issues. The first thing I want to point out is I've probably done this 20 to 50 times. I don't use this editor if I can help it, but I have done it for demonstration and, to help students, and it almost never works entirely. So I always dread using it. So if you're a Google person, I'm happy it works for you. It's never worked for me entirely without an error. So for those of us that don't get it to work every time, you should be familiar with this little drop-down menu here at the upper right once you open up your editor. You want to click on that and then be familiar with this restart. So I find that it restarts itself probably once in a 30-minute session, and I have to probably restart it once or twice if I'm doing a 60-minute session, something like that. And when you go to restart it, Google will say, hey, why are you restarting? And here are some of the choices. VM is unresponsive. I would say I get that a fair amount. Want a clean VM state. I don't know why you would do that unless there was something else going wrong. And other, which, is a few other things. For example, I've had it so that I cannot edit my files. I cannot start Docker. And there's been numerous other little bizarre errors. And the problem with this is if you're new and you're working on it and something's not working, you're not sure whether it's you, whether it's your code, and then it turns out you just need to restart the Cloud Shell editor and everything works. Anyway, so don't go too far down a rabbit hole if things are not working the way you think they should. Just go ahead and restart the editor, and hopefully that'll work for you. The good thing about these cloud platforms is that you don't need any preparation. You can have a laptop that hardly does anything. Maybe even a tablet would work. I've not tried it on a tablet. So you don't need to do anything. You just need to have an account on your platform. In this case, I'm doing the Google platform. And so let's go ahead and see if we can get it to work. These are the steps we're going to go through. If you like my previous videos, they're very similar. I'm going to deploy a PySpark application, and I'm going to log into Google Cloud Platform. I'm going to create a project, so I'm going to start from scratch, entirely from scratch. I'm going to create a new project. I will go ahead and create a Google Kubernetes engine cluster. That's a cluster running Kubernetes, and I'll make it a minimal one just so I can demonstrate it. It doesn't cost me a lot of money. I will connect a terminal to that cluster so that I can run my setup script. And my setup script installs the Spark operator. I will connect the Google Cloud Editor, and you just open the editor. Once you have a terminal, there's a button there to open the editor. I'll connect that editor to the cluster, and usually it recognizes it, but you can use a Google Cloud gcloud command to connect it, your editor, your terminal, to the cluster. I'll create an artifact repository. This is the same steps you're going to do if you're doing it from your own computer, but I need to place my PySpark image in some sort of registry, and there's a setup in GCP for the artifact repository. Then once I have the address for that, I'm going to edit a couple files that are the YAML files so that they don't point to just a generic image, but the image that's on the registry. Then I will submit my application to the cluster and review the results. And unfortunately, I'm not expecting it to work. So I'll point out a couple times if I have to restart the editor or whatever. I might even have to stop and start the whole thing. I'm not going to do too much of that, but I'll let you know when things go right or wrong. So let's see if we can get this to work by opening the editor and working through to create our application on the cluster. So just a reminder, these are the steps I've got to work through. And let's go ahead and go to our Google Cloud Platform dashboard. Here I am, and I've just started with no project. Starting from the very beginning here, I'm going to start up a project. I'm going to call it Data Demo 4, just for fun. And as always, I like to make sure that the project has a simple ID that I can remember, because typically I have to use it. And let's go ahead and create this project. Once the project is up, I can connect to it. You note at the upper right here, I've got a place for a terminal, and that's what I'm going to use in order to create a terminal and also open up my editor. But for now, because I know I've got my plan here, I'm going to go ahead next. I'm going to create my cluster. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump to that, skip over the terminal part for now. So let's go create a cluster, and you'll find it under the Kubernetes engine cluster. You might have to enable your API, especially if this is the first time for this project you've worked with it. I started from scratch. I just created a new project, so I'm going to have to enable these APIs for the Kubernetes engine and also for the artifact repository here when I get to that. For the service is enabled, I can go ahead and create the cluster. I notice that sometimes when the API is enabled, it won't update the display. So you might look at the right here, there's some notification. You might get a notification but not update the display. So it can be a bit frustrating. You think that the display is going to be updated, but it doesn't. So you might refresh the page or look at your notifications to see if the API or anything else is done. That way you're not waiting too long. All right, next up, I'm going to create my cluster. And when you get used to doing it, you can just jump right in and use this cluster creation form. But I'm going to go ahead and start with this, my first cluster, which is a good way to get started. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to customize it a little bit. I'm going to give it a name that I can remember. For me, I'm going to choose South because I've had bad luck with some of these other regions, meaning that it'll run for about 30 minutes and then say it doesn't have enough resources, which can be frustrating if you're trying to get a project to go and it happens 3 times. You spent 90 minutes and still won't have a cluster going. So I'm going to do US South 1C and hope that this will give me a cluster. I'm going to modify the series here. It seems to me, based on availability, E2 seems to work pretty good. 4 gigs is probably fine for this demo. I can go on to make some changes, and I'm back to this form I had before. I can modify some of it. I won't, but just to let you know that you can go through and edit some of this. Okay, so this will work for us. I'm going to go ahead and create the cluster. This, I would say, typically takes between 5 and 15 minutes, and you'll get a cluster. So keep track of it. You might look at your notification in the upper right to see whether you get a notification, even though the display here might not update. After a bit, our cluster is up and running. Ignore the low resource request. We just started it, so there's no big deal there. And let's go look at our cluster. I just click on it. Now I want to connect to it. And I want to use this connect command, this gcloud. It's going to, if you look at the details of it, it's going to run the gcloud, which is the cloud SDK, the container command, clusters, get credentials for data demo cluster 1. That's the cluster I just created. It's in zone south. And the overall project it's within is data demo 4. So let's run this in the Cloud Shell, and that'll get us started with editing projects, some PySpark code for this cluster. What's going on now, it's making a virtual computer, and the virtual computer is going to be connected to the cluster. And it provides for me this command, which I copied in, but it went ahead and pasted it in to my terminal, my shell here. I can do it. Return to execute the command. I'm going to authorize the use of this. And everything should work. I can do a listing to see what's in my project. I've got a previous project I've been working on, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove this. So it starts from scratch. And you can see that there's nothing here in my project. But the other part of it is I wanted you to see that your files will persist over time. So if I upload some project to this cloud terminal, then those files will remain there. And next time I go to use this terminal, they'll be there. Now, just for fun, let's run a kubectl command. And if we use our Cloud Shell editor with the Cloud Code plugin, then we don't have to run a lot of these commands. But I'm going to go ahead and run this just to see that if my my cluster that I just created is connected to this terminal. And you can see there's a star there, an indication I just created this one. And you can see another one from a previous demo. I'm going to delete that old configuration so that it's not confusing. And we see that we've got our terminals connected to that cluster that we created. So we're pretty much ready to go. Let's go ahead and open up our editor and see what that looks like. And then we'll go ahead and continue on with our steps. And our steps are going to be to, well, we did these steps. Next step, we're going to run this setup and connect our cloud editor to the cluster. So I'm looking right now at these two steps. So let's open up our editor. Our editor opens up, and we can see some of the items with our editor here in this left. If I click on the first one, I can see the file system. Let's get rid of this at the bottom. See what files I have. I can do search. Next one is for connecting to a version control system. Next is running a program. And then I've got some cloud code stuff. So the most important one for us is the very first one to look at our files. And then the view down here to look at our cluster. This is also found if I go to view and open a view here and open up the Google Kubernetes cluster, so you can see down here. So what do I have down here at the bottom with this Kubernetes cluster plugin? This is part of the Cloud Code plugin. I can see that I have a description of where my clusters are found, and that's the same command that we ran before with our terminal, where we did get context. And that's this config lists the clusters that my system should look for. In this case, there's only one cluster going, and that's this one, this demo 4 south. So if I click on the drop down, I can then work with the cluster. One of my gripes about this system is, my complaints about the system is when I click on these things, typically they're very slow and non-responsive, and sometimes I just have to restart things to get it to work. But okay, let's see if we can get it to work now. I look and see there's no pods, and if you look down here at the bottom, there's no Spark operator. So what I'm going to do next is install that Spark operator. So let me go to my terminal, and I also want to point out that I've got a terminal here inside the editor. So I've got a terminal inside the editor and a terminal outside the editor. Let's look at the one outside the editor first. As I mentioned before, I have no files here, and I want to run a setup. So I'm going to run this setup, which is part of my project. So I can run it here, and then back to the editor, or I can run it inside terminal inside the editor. So I could do new terminal. Now, just to do a listing here, I'm in the same spot. And where is that spot? I'm in my home of my user ID, which if you look at the upper left file system, it's the same thing. Here's my user ID. All right, so next I want to install this setup script, but in order to do that, I have to get the files. So I'm going to use get here, and I want to essentially do a open the command palette, and the shortcut may work for you, Control-Shift-P, but sometimes it interferes with, in my case, Firefox commands. So I'm going to go ahead and use the menu item here, Control-Shift-P, and I want to do a git clone. And I want to select a repository. And sometimes this might not work for you, so I found that if for whatever reason the git clone doesn't show up, then you can go ahead and open up a workspace and select your root here. And once you do that, then you'll be able to run the git clone command. All right, where do I want to get from? I want to get my project. Well, I've got it here on this repository that's part of this data demo. So I'm going to use the K8 Spark, and I'm going to get the code, which is, there's a command here to get the code. And I'm going to copy the path. I'm going to use that path from GitHub in order to get my source control. So there's my clone, GitHub clone. I paste in the path, do a return, and then it should download the files from GitHub. And I can see them here. And if I went over and looked to my terminal, I can do a listing there, and I can see that there's a K8 Spark, so I can list K8 Spark and maybe change the directory to that folder and see that I've got the files there. Just to see that everything is all consistent, I can open up my terminal here and change directory to the K8 Spark and do listing, and yep, everything is the same. So this is just providing a view into that directory on this virtual computer in the cloud. Next up, I want to run the setup script I've been talking about, and here it is here. So I want to make sure I'm connected to my Kubernetes cluster, which I am. But if I hadn't been connected for whatever reason, I'd want to grab that command, the gcloud command, and run it. And fortunately, I have run it, and I can use it here. And you can also put it in the other window just to show you. Let's go ahead and copy this. So I'm going to go back to my editor and paste it in here. Same thing, just demonstrating that I'm connected to the, get the wrong cluster, connected to the cluster. So let me make sure I connect to the right cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I get that command. It should be the correct command here. Zero 03, that looks correct. Okay, let's copy the correct command and paste it. And it should be the correct cluster now. It was before. I just want to demonstrate that I can do the same commands here in this terminal as I can in my other terminal. They're the same thing. Okay, so once I'm connected to that cluster, which is the same one shown in this window here, which is available from this plugin, now I can go ahead and run my startup script. So I can try typically to run, setup.sh, and it has a configuration parameter cloud, but it's going to say it's not available to run. So I'm going to chmod, change the permission, chmod plus execute setup. And now let's try that command again. And one fortunate thing about this setup is that Helm is already installed. So if you look in the details, it updates Helm, but it's already installed. If I ran this on my home computer, I'd have to install Helm first typically. And then thereafter, it installs the Spark operator and sets up the service account for Spark. And then it should be ready to go for us. There should be some notable change because of our command. And you'll see that the Spark operator has been installed. And that's shown here at the left. So that looks like it worked. And just to see that what else is going on, I'm going to click on this nodes. Of course, it's not doing anything. It is frozen. But anyway, if I do at one point get this nodes to work, I'll click on it. It will list the nodes. It should show 3 nodes. So at that point, I'm ready to go. I've got a Spark operator. I've got my cluster. It looks like everything's ready to go. And I'll go ahead and go to my next step. So I've done all of these here, and now I've got to do an artifact registry and edit some files. That's where I am next. So maybe while I'm doing that, the cloud editor will catch up. So let's go on. So I'm going to go to this menu. I'm going to go look at the artifact registry. I'm going to open it up just for fun in a different window. I right-click or control-click. And now I've got open a different tab. I've got one tab for my editor, another tab for my other commands I'm working on the Google Cloud Platform. Because this is the new project, I'm going to go ahead and enable this registry, so that'll take a moment. Once I've enabled my registry API, now I can go ahead and create a registry, a repository for my images. And if you see the previous video, there's a step-by-step on how to do this. There's not a lot to it. I just give my repository a name here, data demo repo, for example. It's going to be a Docker repository. I'm going to put it in the same region as I had previously, which for me was the south. And the rest of it can remain default. It's not unusual to get these sorts of errors, I've noticed, and it's just saying that you just now recently enabled the registry API, and now you're going to use the API, but it's not ready for you, even though, of course, it showed that it was ready. So we wait a little bit, and I'll press the create button again, and it'll work. I press the button, and then this time it tells me it already exists, so I guess that's good. So it worked. It doesn't know that it worked, but it gave me an error message. It worked, and then I pressed retry, and that was an error message, but whatever. Okay, so we got our registry to go, and I can click on it and see that I've got a place to store my images. Now, clicking on that, it's going to say, well, you need another API in order to manage it. So I'm going to click on that to enable it. So let's go ahead and give it a go. Eventually, I'll be able to have access to it. So as I have access now, and there's one more step I have to do. I have to create some credentials. And so I'll go through the clicking process here to create the credentials. So I'll click on the credentials, and this form to be filled out here. I'm going to do artifact API. I'm going to do application data. Yes, I'm running the GKE. And so I select application data, and yes, I'm running, and then I'm done. So that'll take a moment, and then my registry for my Docker image in the cloud will be enabled. Then I can send my images to be created to that location. So let's just go to see that, make sure everything's working. So I look at my artifact registry repository, and I'm going to grab the path here in a moment. So I click on this data demo repository, and now this is my path. I'm going to copy the path to it. You could type it out, I guess, but I'm going to copy it so that I remember that path. And this will be important in a moment. So now I'm going to go back to my editor, which I left open in another tab. And I'm at the lower left, you can see the nodes did show up after clicking on the nodes. So things seem to be working. And I'm about ready to do some small edits in order to deploy my application to the cloud Kubernetes engine and the associated repository. I'm going to look at my to-do list, and I've done everything down to here. All this is done, and now it asks me, the to-do item is just to double check that your YAML files that describe your images and some work to be done with the images, make sure they're pointing to the appropriate repository, the one that I just created, or artifact registry as it's called here. All right, so now I look at my files, and let's go to the file system in the upper left here, and look for files that end in YAML, Y-A-M-L. And the one that's going to be important for me is the scaffold one here, and also under the resources, the Spark Hello. And so let me move this a little bit out of the way. And the first one will be scaffold. And if you look inside the scaffold, it says where to build the image. That's my Docker file. And then what is the image name? This is going to be the key. The image name must be prefixed with your registry, unless you're doing it on, say, Docker for desktop. Then you don't have to worry about it because it's a local registry, or maybe Minikube. But there's my prefix to my registry. That's where my image is going to be stored, and then my image name is at the last. So I edited that to include the proper place for my, I was going to save it, and that was my Control S by accident, but it's saved. Okay, and then the next place I'm going to edit it is there's a scaffold file, and then the way I've set up this project, there's a Spark operator file for the same thing. And in this Spark operator file, I've got an image name, and the same idea applies here. I've got to prefix it with my registry. So I've got my registry location and then my image. I'm just going to double check here about this image pool policy. If I'm on Docker on desktop, I'll comment it out. But here I'm on the cloud. I'm going to leave it the image policies always. All right, I should be ready to go. If I look at my list, I've done everything, and including my edit my YAML files. Okay, that should be good to go. But I've discovered that on the cloud code plugin works differently than if I run it on my PyCharm or VSCode. And that is, the difference is that normally I have these 3 different files here, or for however many applications, and I'll run a scaffold for each one of them. All right, so let's go look and see what that looks like and then talk about it. So I'm going to run, and I would run like a configuration. This is a run configuration, and it refers to my scaffold file here. So here's the scaffold file I've been talking about. And if you look at it, it refers to Spark Hello, has a Docker file and an appropriate image, and it should be ready to go. And I want to launch this from scaffold in order to build the image and then deploy it. These run configurations for everything, including scaffold, are found here. I can open my configuration, and I've already got one here because I've edited this before, so let me get rid of this and start from scratch. Okay, now I have no run configurations. So let me go ahead and add one, add configuration. And you're looking for a cloud code, because I'm working on cloud code Kubernetes application. And I see it here in the list, cloud code run debug Kubernetes app. When I select that, it's going to add it to my list of run configurations, which is found in my launch.json. And you can find it within the VIA folder, which has configuration files, and there you'll find a configuration file for launch.json. The same thing goes with VSCode or PyCharm. The interface is slightly different. Here I can go ahead and change the name slightly to be Hello Py, because it's sort of a Hello application and it computes Py. I'll leave the rest of it. You can see the type is a cloud code Kubernetes application. It's going to be a launch. It's going to refer to the scaffold file, which is in my workspace scaffold. And if you put it in some other folder, just be aware of that. And one of the things I need in order for this thing to work is I need to add one more item, is that the image registry. So I need to specify where the image registry is. And if you recall, we just got done editing that. I can grab the image registry description from here, or one of the other 2 files I edited, and I'll put it in my launch.json. So that's where the image registry is going to be. And I know that that's going to be the case. You can use these variables, but I'm going to skip over that. And we're just going to go ahead and have the exact path here to our registry. And hopefully this will work. Okay, so next up, I want to run this, and there's a couple ways to run it. I press this button here over in the left, and I get a drop down. And if I have more configurations, you'll see it. Right now, I just have this one, and I want to press the play button, and it should run. But for me, this scaffold works a little bit. This Cloud Code plugin scaffold works a little bit different than it does on my PyCharm, and that is it'll look through all of these files and run them. And I don't want that. I just want the one that's listed here. I want it to run this scaffold file here, but for whatever reason, it looks around and finds these other ones. So I'm going to get rid of these for now. And let's see if I can, just to make sure this works for me, we can play around, see if other things can work. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and move from this directory my scaffold, Airbnb, and my scaffold, Jupyter. I've got a couple different applications here. And I'm going to move them up outside of my project directory so that they don't appear. And hopefully Cloud Code won't try to run them, because it seems to run them if I have them. All right, so now I think I'm finally ready to go. So I'll look at my list, did all of these things, and now I can go ahead and submit my job to the cluster. So as I mentioned, I can view the cluster by looking at this command here, and then I'm going to run it by looking at this plugin here. So let's give it a go, and we should be able to see in a moment down here there'll be a new window of output. So let's see if it works. I'll press my play button, and it starts up, and of course I can stop and reset and do other things. Over on the right, it might ask me to fill out some things, and then also have a choice here about how much output I get. If you look at this drop down, in a moment it's going to say detailed. Right now it just says hello Py Kubernetes run, the name of my config, but in a moment I'll have one for detail. Right now in this Cloud Code plugin, it's going to just double check that I've got things properly done. Yes, I'm doing my local build using Docker. It does know the proper context of my Kubernetes. It does have the proper image registry, which it picked up. It thinks there's a couple images because it looked through. Why it does this, I don't know. I didn't ask it to look through, but there's a couple other manifests that describe my other images in Airbnb and Jupyter. I didn't edit those, and so it still has the older name without the prefix. I'm just going to ignore that. And then the one that I do have, the image for, these are my files I'm working with right now that specify my image. So I looked at scaffold, you can see the image name is here. Okay, so what would you like to use for builder? I'm going to use Docker for that. And it specifies a Docker file, and I guess I could have some more advanced build settings here. Okay, so that should work. Ignore the other image, which I didn't ask it to work on, but it seems to be a little bit more invasive than the one that runs on PyCharm. All right, so let's give it a go now. I'm going to run it by doing build. It's going to ask me about my context, even though it was above listed. I'm going to select the one that I have, and it should be in progress. I can click on this Kubernetes run to see some of the details, and you can see above it's showing some information. As I mentioned before, I can look down here at my output. Here we go. And this output, I can also have a more detailed one, which I prefer. So I select my detailed, and then I can see a little bit more about what's going on. And this is going to take a little time. It's going to build the image. So it's a Docker image. It's quite large because it relies on some other images and then finally copies in my files. And then after that's done, it's going to send it to the registry. So it's going to take a little bit of time. Fortunately, I had a few troubles with the Cloud Shell editor, and I'm going to show you some of the issues that have come up and then try to complete this project, although it doesn't exactly work the way I'd like to. It seems like there's still some bugs in the Cloud Shell editor. So first I want to point to the current version I have, and hopefully they'll fix some of these issues. So this is the current version I have of Cloud Shell Editor with Cloud Code extension. And I just got that from doing help and release notes. And that lets me know what the current version is. Okay, now on to some issues. I just want to point out that there can be some confusion. I think I pointed this out earlier, but to be clear, if I open up a workspace, I might start with my original root. And then once I've downloaded a project, I want to switch my workspace to that project. So I just want to switch to show you the difference. So now I'm in my root of my login, and you'll note there that I've downloaded this K8 Spark project from GitHub. And once I've done that, I want to make sure that I'm in that workspace and all the operations work off of that base directory. Right, next up, an issue with the version that I've been working with, and not a prior version, but the current version, is if you have more than one scaffold file, then it can be confused and try to deploy multiple versions or multiple scaffold projects. So one way to address that is go to File Settings, File Preferences, and open the UI settings. And there, under the extensions, you'll look for Cloud Code settings, and it's multiple scaffold. So when I enable that, I don't quite have so much trouble of it trying to deploy multiple applications. When I just want to deploy each one separately, I want to deploy my Hello World, my Jupyter, and my Airbnb, and I've got separate resources. So once I've checked that, that didn't quite have so many troubles. All right, so two issues. I've checked the settings for Cloud Code multiple scaffold. Enabled multiple scaffold config keys. Okay, so now it should be ready to go, and I can run it here, my application, by deploying it, and I can also deploy it by selecting this Explorer for the cluster. And right now I only have one application, and if I click on this gearbox, I can also view my applications. Sometimes I've noticed it doesn't work, and then of course I go over here to restart my shell editor. All right, so I can see that I could add more applications if I wanted to. So next up, I can run it here, or I can run it here, either one. Because I only have one, it's going to only run the one. So let's go ahead and play it. And then it should go through my build process. I'll go ahead and authorize. And then I'll select over at the right, I'll select the drop-down for the detailed log. And it takes a long time the first time as it builds the image and deploys it. And thereafter, it's pretty quick. But next up, I would want to click on this pods and see some of the details, but it's been my experience today, this is too slow and just doesn't work. So instead of that, I'm going to use the old-fashioned way, and I'm going to type into my terminal here some kubectl commands. Kubectl get pods -a for all, just to see. And right now it's just loading things up. And if I look at the upper left, it looks like it's building. It looks like it's deployed. So I should have my Spark, Spark image that's going to run my Spark Hello here in a moment. After a bit, I do see that it deploys. I'll show you a little bug that seems to crop up, but anyway, it did deploy this time, and ideally it's going to show up over here, but it just never seems to show up within a reasonable amount of time. So instead of wait for that, I'm going to go ahead and say kubectl logs, and I'm going to get it continually from my Spark Hello driver, pod Spark Hello driver. And once I do that, it outputs the logs. Now, ideally, I'd see it over here on the left, and unfortunately, it never seemed to respond. Occasionally, you do get to respond. And then I try to get the logs, and the logs don't work either. So right now, this day, it's not responding. But in any case, I can go ahead and do as I've done here, and just do it the old-fashioned way with kubectl, and I see the results are here. You can see the display is a little bit slow as it finally shows the drivers running and some of the executors are running. But unfortunately, of course, this is all done. And if I try to look and see what's there, everything is finished already by the time this thing displays on the left. Right now, the driver is still there. I would like to delete it. Maybe I could, at one time, this used to work where I would select the driver here on the right and delete it, or press the stop button and it would remove it. And that's because the configuration used to work where you'd select this configuration here in your launch. And if you look at one of the options there, cleanup is true, and then it would remove the image, the container from the cluster. Today, none of that's working, so I'm just going to go on and hopefully finish up the demo. So you can see that I've got this driver still here, and I want to remove it. So just to be sure, again, I'll hit, I'm looking at all my pods just to see what's going on. It's not there, so I'm going to delete it. And the command here I'm going to use is delete among the pods, the one that has a label Hello Spark Hello. And I run it, and it should be deleted. I'll check my pods again, and it's gone. And if you want to know why that works, let's go look at our files and see that I've got the description of my Spark operator here for my application. And you can see Spark Hello is the name of it, but on the labels, I've got Spark Hello also. That's what I meant to refer to. And so when I deleted the application, the label that has app equals Spark Hello, then it finds that image, and that container removes it. Okay, so that works. The second time, of course, it does not work because it's not there. So back to my cluster, you can see it's still working away. This thing, unfortunately, today doesn't work. It's not worth really anything. It's just frustration. But normally you'd click on this, and it will expand the pods just like it does in VS Code or PyCharm. You'd see the pods, and you can delete it, and you can also see the executors being created. Sometimes you can right-click on it and get the logs, and it'll display the logs in a panel in the upper right here. And sometimes it doesn't work. But it's supposed to be similar to what you see in VS Code and in PyCharm, which works great. Here, it doesn't work so well. So let's look at some of the other files. I could run the Airbnb example, and there's a Jupyter example as well. And ideally, when you run it, it should give you a URL, and you should be able to connect to that URL and view the Spark UI. It's supposed to do the port forwarding so that you can view it. Today, that's not working. Just for fun, let's see if we can do another example and see if it'll work. I have pretty low hopes on this, but let's give it a try. So I've got some configurations here. I can add another one, and I'm just going to copy this one and paste it. You can also do add configuration here, and unfortunately you can see it's loading, it's not working, but normally you'd get a list of configurations, and I would choose the Cloud Code configuration for run, but of course it's not working now. Another way to do it is just go ahead and copy and paste. So I just grab the one that's there and paste it. It's identical. They're comma separated between these curly braces. And instead of hello, I'll use Airbnb or something like that, Airbnb. So I've got a demo of Airbnb. And if I look at my files, it's going to be scaffold Airbnb. So let's see if I can get that one to work. A, B, and B. Everything else is the same. I just got a different startup, essentially. One runs run. That's hello PI for computing. I'm sorry, the run must be for Airbnb. And then I've got run PI for the computing Pi, and then Jupyter. So now I've got two configurations by adding one to this list. Got to make sure that I've got a comma between them. It looks good to me. Now if I go to my run, I should have a drop down here, and sure enough, I got the second one. And I'm curious if this is going to work. It used to be the case I could run here. Can I get a selection of another one to run? And it doesn't show it, of course. All right, let's skip that. Let's go ahead and go to this run configuration here and run it from here. So I'll do Airbnb and press the play button. And ideally this will work. We'll see if today we get it to work. And it's not showing up yet, so maybe it's not going to work today. I went ahead and restarted my editor, and now I'm going to select run on Kubernetes, and this time it does show up. Let's see if it'll get going. It's asking me to fill out some more information as I've done before. It looks like it's pretty good. After a little bit, it seems to get going. Let's see if we can go look at it using the old-fashioned way. And I guess I should see what the name of the pod is first. It should be something about Airbnb. May take a moment to deploy. After a bit of time, it does deploy. I had forgot to change the image name here inside my Airbnb YAML file. So if you look at the Airbnb YAML file in the resources, the first time I ran it, I didn't update the path to the registry followed by the image, and then it didn't deploy. And that's because the nodes which were on the cluster, they wouldn't be able to pull the image. Got a few nodes here and they can't pull the image. Once I updated that and then I went ahead and deployed it, then I get my pods here, which I can list, and I can see there's my Airbnb driver pod. So it's likely to be done by now, but let's see if it's still running. And there it is. And I'll do some logs for it. Right now it's still pending. When it's once it gets running, then we'll be able to look at the logs. We can see that it's up and running. And then we can look at the logs. The log statement is pretty simple. Kubectl logs, and then you list the name of the pod through a label, or in this case, just the pod Airbnb, and F is going to continually update the logs as the logs change. It'll stream the logs. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. It seems to be working. It's a little bit slow. The disappointment is that this cluster browser is not working properly. Normally you'd update and you'd see the executors here. You'd be able to right click and describe them, right click and look at the logs, and it's not working very well right now. So let's go ahead and stop it. So I'm going to look at my two commands here for running, and then down here for looking at my Kubernetes deployment. I'm going to go look at the running, and I've got my restart and stop. I'm just going to go ahead and stop it for now. Okay, so that's about it. I'll go back to my project and just note that it's important that when you open up your workspace, you open up the one for the project that you've downloaded. In this case, it's the PySpark project. So back to our to-do list. We logged in, we created a project, created a Kubernetes cluster. We initialized the cluster with a setup script, which creates a Spark operator and also initializes the Spark account. We connected our cloud editor to the cluster. We created a artifact registry for the Docker images. We then edited a couple of the YAML files to make sure that they have a prefix before the image name, so that we use the registry and then the image name. Then we submitted the job to the cluster, and for the most part it worked. I had to do a couple of restarts. It's important that when you download your project from GitHub that you change into that directory to make that your workspace folder. When you do that, then you can run on Kubernetes. And in my case, I couldn't get the browser to work very well in terms of the cluster browser. So instead, I used the old-fashioned way using kubectl to look at logs and also look at the number of pods. So we're able to look at the results as well that way. So in summary, this was a demonstration of how to use Google's Cloud Shell editor. It includes the Cloud Code plugin. I was able to deploy the project from GitHub on the Kubernetes cluster. Overall, the idea is it should work the same as it does on PyCharm and on VSCode. My personal experience is it just does not work very well, and I loathe to use it, so I try never to use it. Hopefully in a year or maybe 6 months, it'll be efficient and won't have to be restarted and have all sorts of troubles where you can't browse the cluster editor and so forth. But on the other hand, if you don't have a laptop that has any memory, then this is one way to go. I wouldn't expect too much out of the browsing of the cluster, but I'd have to use the kubectl commands more often than not. So in any case, I hope it works for you. Good luck.